The sound of her heels echoed across the marble floor as Emily Carter walked through the grand lobby of Collins & Co. Enterprises, her worn-out leather bag clutched tightly in one hand and her ID badge dangling slightly crooked from the other. The building was sleek, sterile, and intimidating. Glass walls, polished silver elevators, and a constant hum of rushed footsteps. For many, it was a place of ambition and prestige. For Emily, it was survival. She had been working at Collins & Co. for nearly 2 years, quietly, diligently, without ever complaining. As an administrative assistant on the 3rd floor, she handled overflowing schedules, endless email threads, last-minute changes, and unreasonable demands with a calm precision that often went unnoticed. She was efficient, reliable, and smart. Too smart, perhaps, for a job that paid her just enough to keep her mother's medications stocked and rent paid for their modest 2-room apartment. Every morning, she arrived before sunrise, her fingers slightly trembling from the cold and caffeine. She'd turn on the lights in the office, prepare the meeting rooms, and ensure every file was in place for the executives above her. And yet, she was invisible, especially to Mr. Richard Collins, the man whose name was stamped in gold on the glass office door at the end of the hall. Richard was everything people feared and envied in a CEO. Tall, well-groomed, always dressed in tailored navy suits and polished shoes, he carried the air of a man who believed the world was built solely for his benefit. To him, people like Emily were background noise. Tools, replaceable. Emily had lost count of how many times he ignored her greetings, tossed papers on her desk without a single word, or muttered snide remarks about her appearance loud enough for others to hear. "You look tired. Again," he once said, smirking as he glanced at her unpolished nails and scuffed shoes. That day, she smiled faintly and said nothing, even as something inside her chest twisted painfully. The office was a battlefield, and Emily had learned to wear her silence like armor. Behind closed doors, she was often berated for the smallest mistakes. Not hers, but ones passed down from careless managers who needed someone lower to blame. If a spreadsheet was late, it was Emily's fault. If a meeting was double booked, somehow she should have foreseen it. Once, Richard had slammed a file on her desk in front of a dozen colleagues, his voice cold and cutting. "If you can't even handle basic admin tasks, what exactly are we paying you for?" Laughter followed, fake, forced, but sharp enough to pierce through her pride. She excused herself to the restroom that afternoon and cried quietly in the stall, pressing a fist to her mouth to muffle the sound. She didn't cry because she was weak. She cried because she had no one to tell, nowhere to release the weight she carried every day. Her mother's condition was worsening. Bills were piling up, and she couldn't afford to lose this job. Yet every insult, every dismissive look, every sneer from Richard and his circle made her question her worth. Was she really that forgettable? That disposable? Still, she showed up. Every single day. She showed up when her mother was rushed to the hospital. She showed up when her shoes had holes from too many rainy walks. She showed up even when the weight of humiliation made her hands tremble as she typed. No one knew that Emily Carter, quiet, plain Emily, had a degree in business administration from a top university. That she had dreams once. That she used to design business plans at night and imagined herself running a company where employees were respected, not crushed. But dreams were a luxury, and Emily had learned to bury hers. So she kept her head down, answered every call, filed every document, and swallowed her pain with cold coffee and fake smiles. And all the while, Richard Collins continued his reign, untouchable, arrogant, and blissfully unaware that the woman he looked down on was slowly building something stronger than resentment. She was building a fire, a quiet, slow-burning fire that no one could see. Not yet. But one day, he would. The days blurred into weeks, and weeks into months. For most people at Collins & Co., time meant progress, bonuses, promotions, prestige. But for Emily, time meant survival. Her world shrank into repetitive cycles. Early mornings spent double-checking schedules, late nights fixing someone else's errors, and long hours of enduring the subtle, constant erosion of her dignity. It was always the same pattern. A small mistake would happen. Someone forgot to send a follow-up email, a typo slipped into a presentation slide, a client was left waiting on the phone, and somehow it always circled back to Emily. Not because it was her fault, but because she was the easiest to blame. She had no title to defend her, no status to shield her, and no voice that anyone cared to listen to. During a weekly executive meeting, the air was stiff and overly perfumed, thick with tension as the board sat around a long mahogany table. Emily stood quietly near the side, hands clasped, ready to distribute printed agendas. She wasn't even supposed to be there, just the assistant helping behind the scenes. But when one of the board members questioned a missing report attachment in the meeting packet, Richard Collins's eyes locked on her like a hawk spotting prey. "Of course," he said sharply, tossing the file onto the table. "It's Emily, again." She blinked. The report wasn't hers. She hadn't even seen it. But she didn't get the chance to explain. "Is it that hard to do your job?" Richard's voice cut through the room, low but firm. "It's Admin 101. How many times do we have to revisit this, Miss Carter?" A few snickers echoed across the room. One of the senior managers smirked behind his hand. Emily's throat tightened, and she forced her eyes to stay on the floor. Her cheeks burned, but she swallowed the lump in her throat. "I'm sorry," she said softly, though she didn't know what she was apologizing for. After the meeting, no one looked at her. No one asked if she was okay. She walked out of the boardroom, her face a mask of forced calm, even as her knees felt like glass about to shatter. She escaped to the restroom and locked herself in the farthest stall. There, surrounded by pristine white tiles and the faint scent of air freshener, she finally let go. She sat on the closed toilet seat, her hands covering her face, and cried in silence. Not loud sobs, just the slow, painful kind that leak out in quiet gasps, as if the body is too tired to even grieve properly. She didn't cry because she was weak. She cried because she was tired of being strong. That evening, she returned home with puffy eyes and aching limbs. Her mother was asleep on the worn couch, her breathing shallow but steady. Emily sat beside her, brushing a hand across her mother's thinning hair, forcing herself to smile. This was why she endured it all. The humiliation, the blame, the degradation. Because quitting wasn't an option. Not when medical bills were arriving faster than paychecks. Not when she had no backup plan, no wealthy family to fall back on, no one to catch her if she fell. At work, she became the invisible punching bag, the scapegoat of convenience. There were days when she overheard the interns whispering cruel things about her outdated clothes, her quietness, her lack of presence in office gossip. Some days she walked in and found her desk moved or her documents mysteriously lost. She knew it wasn't an accident, but she stayed quiet. She stayed composed. Richard, meanwhile, seemed to take pleasure in her suffering. His comments became colder, more calculated. "Try not to embarrass yourself this time," he once muttered before she handed out files during a presentation. Another time, when she corrected a minor scheduling conflict he had made, he narrowed his eyes and said, "You're paid to assist, not to think." Everyone laughed. Emily didn't. She went home that night and stared at herself in the bathroom mirror, really stared. She didn't recognize the woman in the reflection anymore. Her eyes had grown hollow. Her back slouched slightly, as if carrying invisible burdens. There was no light left, just a quiet ache in her chest that never fully disappeared. But there was something else, too, buried deep beneath the exhaustion and pain. A spark. Small, almost invisible. But there. She didn't know when it had started. Maybe the first time she cried in the stall, or the 2nd, or the 15th. Maybe it was born out of injustice, maybe out of rage, maybe out of the crushing realization that no one would save her but herself. All she knew was she couldn't stay like this forever. One day, she promised herself, one day everything would change. And when that day came, they would remember her name. Not as a girl who made coffee and took blame, but as a woman who rose quietly, powerfully, and without permission. 3 years. That's how long it took for Emily Carter to turn quiet survival into undeniable success. 3 years of sleepless nights, of risking everything she had, of building a brand that no one saw coming. From a small apartment kitchen to a glass-walled corner office overlooking the skyline, her journey wasn't meteoric. It was earned. One client at a time, one breakthrough at a time. And now, the name Carter and Blake Digital was whispered across industry circles, admired for its integrity, human-first branding, and agile campaigns that consistently outperformed billion-dollar competitors. Emily had transformed, not just her career, but herself. The woman who once cried in office restrooms was now the founder of one of the fastest-growing digital marketing firms on the East Coast. Her company had just signed its first international deal with a luxury tech brand based in Singapore. Investors were circling. Media outlets requested interviews, but Emily remained calm, grounded, uninterested in flash. She still wore the same watch she had during her admin days, still took the subway when she could, still visited her mother every Sunday with groceries and stories of the week. Her success had sharpened her, not into arrogance, but into quiet strength. And then came the email that would shift everything. It was from Eastgate Holdings, a multinational firm managing mergers and acquisitions across several industries. They were looking to acquire a struggling legacy company and had selected Carter and Blake to lead the digital audit and post-acquisition brand restructuring. Emily skimmed the documents, eyes pausing as she reached the name of the company, Collins & Co. Enterprises. Her breath caught. She reread the line. Once. Twice. There it was, clear as day, the very company that had once discarded her like trash. The same walls that once held her humiliation now stood on the brink of collapse, hemorrhaging money, abandoned by investors, its once glittering image tarnished by years of poor leadership and digital irrelevance. It felt surreal, like some kind of cosmic joke. But Emily didn't laugh. She stared at the screen for a long time, then slowly leaned back in her chair. Her office was quiet, warm sunlight casting golden light across the wood-paneled floors. Outside, the city buzzed. She said nothing to Daniel or the team. She didn't rage or gloat. She simply accepted the offer and booked the first meeting with Eastgate's senior board. Because now, she wasn't just revisiting a place from her past. She was returning with power. The day of the first executive meeting arrived. Emily stepped into the towering building wearing a tailored black suit, her hair tied in a clean knot, her bag held with confidence, her eyes steady. She walked through the same lobby she once trudged through with trembling fingers and tear-filled eyes. But this time, every step echoed with power. At the top floor, inside the boardroom of Eastgate Holdings, she was greeted with handshakes, nods of respect, and executive folders prepared with her initials printed at the top. She took her seat at the head of the table, flipped open her file, and began reviewing the projected assets and brand risk analysis of Collins & Co. Her voice was clear, decisive. And then, late to the meeting as always, Richard Collins entered the room. Emily didn't flinch. He walked in briskly, dressed in the same kind of navy suit she remembered, though it no longer looked sharp. It looked tired. His hair was thinner, his face slightly hollow. He paused mid-step when his eyes met hers. His face changed. Recognition hit him like a slap. The room went still for a moment, as if the air itself froze. Emily didn't say a word. She simply looked at him, unmoved, unreadable, calm. She turned her eyes back to the document in front of her, adjusted her pen, and continued speaking to the board. Based on our audit, she said evenly, the company has suffered from outdated digital infrastructure, poor brand positioning, and inconsistent leadership messaging. We'll begin the restructuring process immediately. That includes a complete review of executive roles and internal communications. She didn't look at Richard again. She didn't have to. Her presence alone was a sentence. The man who once humiliated her in front of an entire room now sat quietly at the far end of the table, saying nothing, his fingers fidgeting with the corner of a legal pad. He didn't interrupt. He didn't question her authority. He couldn't, because Emily Carter no longer belonged to that past. She had rewritten the script, and now, without raising her voice or uttering a single insult, she was dismantling the very foundation of the empire that once cast her out. Not with revenge, but with elegance, with brilliance, with power earned in silence and built on her own damn name. The morning sun pierced through the skyline like gold thread woven through concrete. Emily stood across the street from the building that once swallowed her whole. The mirrored glass facade of Collins & Co. reflected not only the sky above, but also the woman she had become. She took a breath, not to calm her nerves, but to ground her purpose. And then she walked. Each step across the pavement echoed louder than the last. The revolving glass door whirred as she entered. It was the same lobby, same polished floor, same reception desk with its sterile smile and stiff security protocol. But everything was different. Because this time, they were expecting her. She was greeted at the front not by a cold-eyed receptionist asking her to please wait, but by a well-dressed assistant holding a clipboard. "Miss Carter," the woman said respectfully, "welcome back. The executive team is waiting for you upstairs. Right this way." Emily smiled lightly. "Thank you." As the elevator doors closed, she saw her reflection in the mirrored walls. Not the teary-eyed girl from years ago, clutching her worn-out bag and apology on her lips, but a woman of poise, of power, of presence. The elevator chimed. Floor 23, the very same floor where she'd once been escorted out like a criminal. As she stepped into the corridor, she could feel it, that ripple. A sudden hush, the rustle of voices tapering down to silence. Heads turned, eyes widened. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. They recognized her, but they couldn't place her at first. Not fully. Not with the way she stood now, head high, strides firm, her heels clicking with unapologetic clarity. It was like seeing a ghost, except this ghost had grown skin of armor and eyes like sharpened steel. She passed by her old department. The desks were mostly filled with new faces, but a few remained. One woman, Clara, from accounting, froze mid-sip of her coffee, nearly choking as her eyes met Emily's. Another man nudged his colleague, whispering something that made both their jaws drop in disbelief. Emily said nothing. She didn't need to. She walked to the glass-walled conference room where the merger transition meeting was about to begin. Inside, a dozen executives stood at the sight of her, unsure whether to offer a handshake or bow. At the head of the table stood Richard Collins, or what remained of him. The man who once commanded the room now looked like he was struggling to keep his footing on shifting ground. His face drained of color when he saw her. A muscle twitched in his jaw. He blinked, as if hoping the vision in front of him was a trick of light. But it wasn't. Emily stepped forward, perfectly composed. "Good morning, everyone," she said, her voice calm and smooth, but unmistakably firm. "Let's begin." Richard opened his mouth, perhaps to say hello, or to stammer out some fractured sentence of acknowledgement, but nothing came out. His silence filled the room louder than any greeting ever could. She turned to the team and began presenting. Slide by slide, strategy by strategy, she explained how the post-acquisition integration would proceed, how their outdated systems would be dismantled, how leadership would be evaluated, how the new vision required adaptability and transparency. She spoke with grace, not malice. Precision, not revenge. But every word was a reminder. She had arrived. On her own terms. Once she had stood trembling before Richard, shamed for mistakes she never made. Now she spoke in the same room, with authority that didn't need to be proven. It was felt, woven into every decision, every glance, every breath she took. When the meeting ended, Richard lingered behind. The room slowly emptied, and for a brief moment, they stood alone, two people bound by a past that no longer belonged to both of them. He finally spoke. "I didn't expect to see you again. Not like this." Emily looked at him, her expression unreadable. "No," she said quietly. "You never expected me to rise." There was no bitterness in her tone, no sarcasm, just truth. He stared at her, but there was nothing he could say that wouldn't feel hollow. Every apology would arrive too late, every excuse too small, every gesture irrelevant. She picked up her folder, preparing to leave. But before she walked away, she turned back for just a second. "You taught me something valuable," she said. "That silence in the face of cruelty can either crush you or shape you. I chose the latter." And then she walked out, not with the slam of the door, but with the soft finality of someone who no longer needed to look over her shoulder. For the first time, she wasn't walking away in defeat. She was walking forward in triumph. And the halls that once swallowed her cries now echoed with the footsteps of a woman who returned not as a ghost from the past, but as the architect of her own legacy. The days that followed moved like clockwork. Meetings, documents, strategy sessions, handovers. Emily was everywhere and yet nowhere to gossip. Her name became both a subject and a silence in the halls of Collins & Co. Staff whispered behind half-closed doors, not out of mockery, but disbelief. Their former assistant, once unnoticed, often dismissed, was now the very person who held their futures in her hands. But Emily didn't indulge any of it. She came and went with grace, never pausing for personal vendettas or whispered payback. Her tone remained calm, her demeanor poised, her decisions firm and fair. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't bring up what had happened years ago. She didn't need to. Because every word she spoke now was sharpened with knowledge. Each glance radiated authority. She gave clear directions to department heads, signed off on key proposals, made structural recommendations that executives twice her age scrambled to execute. And Richard, once the center of the office, now watched from the edges. At one point, during a transitional briefing on organizational restructuring, he tried to contribute. His voice, once commanding, now faltered slightly in the presence of Emily's quiet dominance. "I believe the operations division could. We've already restructured that," Emily said gently, her eyes on the digital chart. "We'll be streamlining the workflow under the new model, as per the board's request. You'll find the revised diagram in your packet." It wasn't dismissive. It wasn't cold. It was complete. He nodded slowly, fumbling with the stapled documents in front of him, flipping pages not because he needed to, but because he had nothing else to hold on to. There were other moments, too. Small ones, yet monumental in their impact. Like the time he lingered in the hallway after a meeting, hoping for casual conversation. "You've built something remarkable," he offered, his voice hesitant. "Thank you," she replied, not even slowing her pace as she walked past. Or the time he waited after the merger summit to offer her a cup of coffee, maybe as a gesture of goodwill or guilt. "No, thank you. I've already had mine," she said politely, then turned her attention to a younger associate seeking advice on brand analytics. He watched her from across rooms, watched the way people listened when she spoke, watched the way she lifted others, mentoring, guiding, delegating with respect. She had become the kind of leader he had never been. And what haunted him most was that she never once asked for acknowledgement. Not once did she reference her wrongful dismissal. Not once did she gloat, even subtly, because Emily wasn't here to prove anything to him. She had already proven everything to herself. It was in her silence where the deepest cuts lived, because it left Richard no room to defend, to debate, or to dismiss. Her silence wasn't passive. It was power refined. It stripped away the masks people like him wore. And under it, Richard found himself face to face with a man he could no longer justify being. He began to feel it in the little things. The way his calendar filled with more mandatory transition calls than strategic ones. The way the board looped Emily in on decisions before him. The way his name, once proudly etched across glass doors, now felt like an echo from a different lifetime. He was no longer steering the ship. He was a passenger. And Emily was the current. She never punished him, never raised a single stone. But in the space between the meetings, in the minutes of quiet where he stared at her across the table, her silence said everything. You broke me once. I built myself back. And now I stand here, not to watch you fall, but to rise without needing you at all. Richard was left not with enemies, but with himself. And sometimes that's the harshest punishment of all. There was no formal announcement, no grand applause, no dramatic shifting of hands, but the news spread like a tide across every floor of the company. Emily Carter had been appointed as the new chief executive officer of Collins & Co. Though under the merged banner, the original name would soon dissolve, along with everything else that represented the old regime. She walked into the executive office, once Richard's fortress, with no fanfare, just quiet footsteps, a small notebook tucked under her arm, and a clear mind. The first thing she did was open the blinds. Sunlight flooded the room that had once been kept dim and private. She stood by the window, looking down at the same city she once walked home through with tear-streaked cheeks and broken pride. Now, the skyline reflected in her eyes, not as something unreachable, but something conquered. Then she got to work. Emily didn't come to destroy. She came to rebuild, with precision, with purpose, and with the same resilience that once held her together in a bathroom stall with trembling hands. Her first act wasn't to fire Richard. She didn't need to. His resignation came quietly, almost gratefully, sealed in an envelope he left on her desk the day after the board's unanimous vote. He didn't ask for a farewell. He didn't look her in the eyes. And Emily didn't chase the moment. She let it pass like wind through an open window. Instead, she gathered her leadership team and began reshaping the company from its core. Departments that were once ruled by fear were now led by collaboration. Voices that were once silenced in meetings were invited to speak, contribute, innovate. The marketing assistant who once tiptoed through the halls was promoted to lead strategist within 3 months, because Emily saw something in her others hadn't. Performance reviews were rewritten to include empathy metrics. Wellness programs were launched. The HR department, once a puppet of corporate cover-ups, was restructured to actually protect people. Every corner of the building began to change, not through orders barked, but through culture shifted. Not through punishment, but through elevation. And she remembered them. The faces of those who looked away when she was cast out, those who smirked, those who stayed silent. But Emily never sought them out for vengeance. She simply worked so well, so clearly, so unshakably, that every person who once doubted her was now forced to admire her. They didn't clap out of pity. They stood for her out of awe. That was her revenge, the elegant kind, the kind that didn't bruise skin but rewrote memory. The kind that didn't humiliate, but inspired fear in the hearts of those who once believed kindness was weakness. She made them remember her not as a victim, but as a visionary. One afternoon, weeks into her new role, Emily walked past the floor she once worked on as an assistant. The desks were still lined up the same way, but the energy was different now, lively, empowered, humming with possibility. One of the interns looked up from her screen and smiled nervously. "Miss Carter, do you ever feel nervous being in charge of all this?" she asked. Emily paused, then smiled, her eyes soft but sure. "Only when I forget that I've already been through worse." The intern nodded, wide-eyed, and Emily continued down the hallway, her heels clicking steadily against the floor, each step not a reminder of pain, but of progress. She had returned to the place where she had once been broken. But not to break anyone else. She returned to build something better, not in spite of her past, but because of it. And in the quiet, graceful glow of her success, she had written the most beautiful revenge of all. She became everything they told her she could never be. The days rolled forward like calm waves against a newly built shore. Emily no longer thought of Richard Collins often. His name appeared in merger files, legacy memos, and internal history footnotes, but in her heart, he was a closed chapter. The kind you revisit once, just to see how far you've come, then place back on the shelf without a trace of bitterness. But one morning, as golden light spilled across her office floor, her assistant knocked gently on the door. "Miss Carter, there's someone asking to see you. He doesn't have an appointment, but..." She hesitated. "It's Mr. Collins." Emily looked up from her screen. For a moment, silence hovered between her heartbeat and her breath. Not out of fear, not even surprise, but a quiet acknowledgement that closure sometimes has a face, and sometimes it knocks. "Send him in," she said softly. The door opened, and Richard stepped in, not with the swagger of a CEO, but with the careful steps of a man carrying a weight too long ignored. His once crisp suit was now modest, his shoulders slightly hunched, not from age but from humility. The man who once towered above meetings now stood like someone searching for the right to speak. Emily didn't stand. She didn't need to. "Emily," he began, his voice lower than she remembered, "I know I have no right to take up your time, but I had to come." She gestured calmly toward the seat across from her desk. He sat, carefully, eyes darting across the office, taking in the space that now bore the signature of someone who had risen without stepping on others to do so. "I've spent the last few months thinking about everything, about what I did," he said, "the way I treated you, the way I let ego and power blind me." He paused. Emily waited. "I was wrong," he said at last, "and I never said that. I never apologized. Not properly. You didn't deserve what I put you through. You were capable, committed, and smarter than I ever gave you credit for. I couldn't see it because I didn't want to. Because you reminded me of everything I wasn't brave enough to be." The words hung in the air, soft but heavy. Emily's expression didn't change. She didn't flinch or soften. She listened. "I'm sorry," he added finally, "for everything." There it was, the apology, the confession. Years late, perhaps, but real. Emily folded her hands on the desk, her voice as calm as a still lake. "I appreciate that you came," she said. "I don't carry anger anymore, Richard, not because it didn't hurt, but because it would have kept me from growing." He looked at her, quietly astonished, not just at her grace, but at the peace she carried like armor made of light. "I don't need anything from you now," she continued. "Not validation, not acknowledgement, not revenge. I've already won the only thing that mattered." He nodded slowly, eyes glinting with something like shame, and maybe, strangely, admiration. "You've built something remarkable," he said. "I hope you know that." Emily allowed a faint smile to touch her lips. "I know." He stood, unsure if he should offer a handshake. She rose too, offering one anyway, professional, firm, and unburdened. "Goodbye, Richard," she said gently. And that was it. He left. No dramatic exits, no backward glances, just quiet footsteps disappearing down the hall of a company that no longer bore his shadow. Emily walked to the window afterward, the city still pulsing with the same rhythm it always had. But now, it pulsed with her rhythm. Not because she had crushed someone beneath her rise, but because she had chosen to rise without hatred. because she had closed the door not with rage, but with grace. She was no longer a product of what happened to her. She was the author of what happened next. The seasons shifted. Autumn painted the city in strokes of amber and copper, and high above the skyline, in a corner office overlooking the horizon, Emily Carter stood not just as a CEO, but as a name that had become larger than her title. The company had flourished under her leadership, but more than numbers, more than profits, it was the culture that changed. That was her true legacy. People no longer whispered out of fear, they spoke out of inspiration. Employees walked taller, ideas were welcomed, voices that had once been silenced now led meetings, mentored others, shaped innovation. Her rise became a quiet revolution. Magazines featured her not just for her business acumen, but for her story. The woman who rose from ashes, they called her, the executive phoenix. Headlines loved her, but Emily never let them define her. Because she remembered, not to hold grudges, but to honor the journey. She remembered the restroom she once cried in, the final walk through the lobby after her dismissal, the small apartment where she stayed up nights drafting marketing plans with trembling hope. But those memories didn't haunt her. They shaped her. One evening, she was invited to speak at a leadership summit, the very same kind of event she once watched online with envy and disbelief. As she stepped on stage, applause echoed through the hall, not for a celebrity, not for a billionaire, but for a woman who had felt every scar, every crack, and had still stood back up. She spoke, not with grandeur, but with honesty. I was once the girl in the background, she said, her voice clear and warm. I was underestimated, talked down to, shamed, fired for something I didn't do, but I never let that moment define me. I let it refine me. The audience was silent, leaning in. I didn't rise because I wanted revenge. I rose because I wanted peace. I didn't succeed to prove others wrong. I succeeded to prove myself right. She paused. Because when a woman is hurt deeply, she can rise even stronger than the one who broke her. Thunderous applause followed, not just because the words were powerful, but because they were true. Back at her office, that night, alone, Emily stood by the window as lights shimmered across the city. Her reflection stared back at her, no longer the ghost of her past, but the full force of her present. She had become more than a name. She had become a symbol of growth, of grace, of fire, rebuilt into strength. She didn't seek to be remembered for the pain. She wanted to be remembered for what she built from it. And in that silence, in that stillness, Emily Carter smiled, not because the battle had ended, but because she had finally won the only victory that mattered, peace within herself.